flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels or City of Demons, depending on who you ask. As we get ready for Halloween, we are staying in theme by bringing you more and more guests themed for Halloween with true stories that have literally scared some people out of their homes, as a matter of fact, just like we had the other night with Keith Linder. Now, we are internationally syndicated via Late Night in the Midlands in the United States, as well as the terrestrial stations associated with Late Night in the Midlands, and in the UK and the EU, Deprogram Radio Network and their terrestrial affiliates as well. Now, as I said, we have two powerhouse guests for you today. The second hour will be speaking to author and filmmaker Mr. John Potash. But the first hour, we're going to be talking about a topic that is true to the season and also something dear to my heart, and that is about paranormal. And specifically, we're going to be speaking with the professor of the paranormal, Mr. Parapsychologist Lloyd Aerbach. Lloyd, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, I see, just before we went on, we were talking about some of your books, and one of them I wanted to interject because I thought it'd be very fitting for the season. But more importantly, can you tell people what a parapsychologist is and where you can get such a degree?
Well, parapsychology is the study of psychic phenomena, so that would be extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, also known as mind over matter, and survival of bodily death, under which falls things like reincarnation and near-death experiences, and, of course, our friendly neighborhood ghosts or apparitions. As far as getting a degree, I mean, there was a degree program at John F. Kennedy University in Northern California back from the late 70s through the late 80s. That's how I got my master's degree. There are currently no degree programs in the United States, and, in fact, very few universities who offer anything to do with parapsychology, thanks to our friendly neighborhood skeptics who have made I guess their life's mission to make us miserable by making the academic climate in the United States really unfriendly, to say the least. The UK, fortunately, you would go to the United Kingdom, actually, to get a degree in parapsychology. As it happens, there are 20-plus universities that have some form of parapsychology on campus and a few that actually have degree programs.
Now, let me ask you about, you mentioned Northern California, JFK University. What about Stanford and the SRI? Because I always thought that was geared towards ESP and parapsychology.
Well, first of all, Stanford Research Institute, which is SRI International these days, was not affiliated, or I should say has not been affiliated with the university for decades. It's an independent contract government think tank. So the only connection Stanford University itself ever had with the field, with psychical research or parapsychology, was back before 1920 when Leland Stanford Junior College, which is what it was at the time, there was a psychologist named Dr. John Coover who actually did some of the first real laboratory research looking at ESP, including the sense of being stared at and a number of other things. In fact, there's a monograph you can get on the Internet Archive published in 1917 with all his research, but there's never been otherwise any connection. SRI was a government contractor that actually did the early remote viewing research in the 1970s.
Now, of all the books you have written, have you touched on remote viewing? Because I would think it has to do with, like, for instance, one of your books, Psychic Dreaming, right? Lucid dreaming. I would think that remote viewing could also fall in that category.
Well, actually, remote viewing doesn't fall in that category, in the category of dreaming, simply because remote viewing happens when you're awake, typically. So Psychic Dreaming book is really about having psychic experiences while you're dreaming. The one book that I've got, I mean, a lot of my books touch on what remote viewing is, but the one book that really goes deeply into it is one I co-wrote with Ed May, Victor Rubel, and Joe McMoneagle, called ESP Wars, East and West, which is the history of the Stargate, the U.S. government's psychic spying program, the Stargate program. Ed May was the program director from 1985 to 95, and Joe McMoneagle, the number one remote viewer for that program, even before 85. And that book actually has, unlike other books on remote viewing and the government projects or programs, that book actually covers the Russian side of things because we have contributions actually from the horse's mouth from several Russian generals, a few KGB people who gave interviews to Victor Rubel and to Ed and to others for this book specifically.
Was it the Soviets who really started the psychic warfare and remote viewing, or did the Soviets start it in a response to what the U.S. started?
Well, it's interesting. There's a story, and it's kind of hard to verify exactly what was going on, but there was a story that leaked to the Russians, to the Soviets in the 1960s, that we had been doing some telepathy experiments with people, someone on land and then in a deep-sea submarine. Because communication was so difficult, let's see if we can communicate via telepathy. And ostensibly, we had success, which is actually not true. We may have tried that experiment, but we certainly did not have success at that. But the Russians took that and ran with it, and they started their own psychic program in the 1960s. And then we started getting word that they were having success, so naturally we had to start an actual program in response to that ourselves. So it's kind of funny that a rumor may have actually started the program in the Soviet Union, which started the program here in the United States.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so because if it wasn't for the rumor, neither nation would have had these actual programs, and that's actually
that's most likely. That's right.
Now, one other book that I also took interest to is Mind Over Matter. Is that specifically about telekinesis? Because I've always been attracted to the idea of having power over matter with my mind.
Right, sure. Psychokinesis is actually the proper term. Telekinesis means action at a distance. It doesn't imply anything to do with the mind. So psychokinesis is movement by the mind. And psychokinesis covers a range of things, including moving objects and metal bending and psychic healing and levitation and teleportation, if that even happens. So it runs a wide range of effects. And that's what the book does. My Mind Over Matter book actually even takes the idea, because this is actually my definition, is how our minds even cause our bodies to potentially do more than what we're told we can do. We have an incredible effect on our own bodies, and just because limits are set doesn't mean limits can't be passed, such as Roger Bannister hitting the 4-minute mile back in 1954 after being told it was physically impossible by everybody, and then having a whole bunch of people do it after that. But the book starts with athletics and then moves into the idea of moving objects, and even has a chapter on how to do it, which I have contributions from the late author Martin Caden, who was able to do telekinesis essentially to move objects.
This limits that we have on ourselves are only imposed by ourselves, by other humans.
Correct.
And so therefore, if others impose it on us, we adapt that belief system, but really it's flawed.
Yeah, I mean, there probably is a limit to what we can do physiologically, but then there are stories like, you hear stories thrown around about the person who's thrown out of a car, the car slipped over, there's a child inside, and this woman kind of reaches over and pulls off the door and pulls her kid out, or lifts up the car. We hear these kinds of stories, and usually the response from people is, oh, that's just adrenaline. Well, actually, it's not adrenaline. Adrenaline might have been involved, but for someone to actually move a car without damaging ligaments and their bones, something that heavy, especially the average person, weightlifters have to be really careful how they pick up heavy weight, because otherwise they will tear ligaments, they will hurt their muscles, they will break bones. So for someone to be able to do that sort of thing, and I've actually talked to 2 doctors who examined somebody who did, is itself a form of mind over matter. Somehow the mind must be telling the body, you're not going to be injured.
When you talk about psychokinesis, Uri Geller comes to mind and his spoon bending.
Yeah.
But then again, so does the Johnny, what is the last name? The show Johnny Carson show in the 70s where he couldn't really do what he was doing. So my question to you is, based on what you've seen and what you know about him for the last 40 some years, do you think he was actually psychic and had the powers to bend the spoons, or was it more of a stage magic trick?
Well, okay, first of all, people do have the ability to do this. I actually just did a spoon bending party in Northern California on Sunday with folks. And Uri, I've known Uri a little bit over the years. Uri definitely kind of falls into both categories. I think that I did an interview with him years ago where I asked him flat out, are you a psychic? And he said, I'm an entertainer. but I have psychic abilities, as does everyone else. And I think that Uri absolutely could do things sometimes, but not all the time. The point you're mentioning about the Johnny Carson show was nothing to do with metal bending. It was a different type of test that they did with him. And I don't even know. I mean, honestly, this is my honest opinion. Considering that James Randi was involved in that whole setup, I'm not sure that there wasn't some sort of, let's say,
rigging,
weighting it down so that there's no way that Geller could have actually done something, even if he was genuinely psychic, because Randi was not known to play fair most of the time. So I have seen Uri do a couple things that I would absolutely consider psychic. A couple of my fellow magicians have seen things that he's done, but I also know that he's an entertainer, and you can't do this all the time. There's no way somebody could go on stage and do things every single time. So there's a combination effect there.
And when it comes to James Randi, I've always been very weary of him, especially since he has his $1 million challenge to prove anything paranormal, but yet he sets up all these conditions that yet it's not really fair anyhow.
Well, so actually, let me stop you, because the $1 million challenge ended a few years ago. It doesn't exist anymore.
I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe some evidence is coming his way that he's probably rethinking about giving his money.
No, I mean, it was ended. They're giving grants out or something like that to skeptics out of that money these days. The issue was the conditions. You're right, the conditions, and it wasn't so much the conditions of the test, because those were agreed upon by both parties. The problem, there were two problems. One, if you read the rules, and I think the challenge is still up on the website, the Randi Foundation website, but if you read the rules and thought about it, put yourself in the position of, I am a star athlete, and I'm going to take this test, and I'm going to bat, if I'm a baseball player, I'm going to bat 1,000, not 500. I'm going to bat 1,000. I'm going to hit a home run every time. If I was that person going for the challenge under the rules that were there, you would absolutely not take that challenge, because the way it was set up, you couldn't sue if they said you cheated. Basically, they could ruin you. Now, you'll have $1 million if you beat the challenge, but they could say you cheated. They could make a big deal about that, and you couldn't sue. Nor could, if you succeeded, would you technically own the right to even say how well you did. You would not be able to really use that because of the way that things were worded legally. There were a lot of issues there. So the better psychics I know who looked at the challenge didn't even want to try it simply because of the legalities there. And then the other side of it, people who did do it, I know of at least a couple of instances where after running through some rehearsal and tightening up the controls to where everybody agreed, rather than letting the person, after 8 hours of doing this, of actually getting a little bit of a rest, because doing it again and again and again is very, very difficult just for any kind of activity. They insisted the final test be part of that entire series, which the person didn't do well, because by that time the person wasn't doing well anyway, since they were tiring.
If I was to have some sort of ability and I would have gone to James Randi and participated in the challenge, if I was able to succeed, yet if I had to be labeled what he would say as a cheater and not be able to sue and have to live by that name, I don't think $1 million or even $10 million would have ever been worth having to live under that name. So I could see why that was never claimed. Now I'm going to shift.
Let me just mention one other thing, and that is that when skeptics bring this up to me, I just flat out ask them, if somebody won the $1 million, would you believe in psychic phenomena?
Usually no,
they
right?
No.
Yeah.
So what's the point?
None. It would exactly. It's what is the point? Because if the whole point is to serve a purpose to show that, hey, something exists outside of what our textbooks show, but yet if people don't believe it, then like you said, what is the whole point? Very scary at that people are so limited and not as open-minded. Considering the time we live in now, there are far more unexplainable things that we could point to and say this is unexplainable for all these reasons that we can identify that we can't explain. Whereas 150 years ago, we didn't have that level of aptitude in science that we could point and say this causes that, and therefore that's the reason for this chemical reaction.
And it's completely scientific when you have something unexplained to explore what it is, rather than to say, oh, it must be this, and then just dismiss it. That's
right.
Unscientific.
It is. That's where you have to run through all the tests to eliminate what it is, and then like you said, explore what it couldn't be by going through the different possibilities of running through it. Now I'm going to shift gears just solely because of tomorrow about one book you did and, of course, anywhere else you've investigated, and that is your guide to haunted San Francisco. Now, this might not be – I've only been to San Francisco once, so I can't really say I'm very familiar with the area, but the Winchester Mansion, is that in San Jose?
It's in San Jose, right. I've definitely been there. This book focused on San Francisco. We had intended to do a series, but unfortunately Annette my co-author passed away a few months after this book came out.
Well, let's start with the Winchester Mansion, and then let's jump to San Francisco. What have you seen at the Winchester, and why do you think it's haunted? And for those people out there who don't know the story as I do, can you tell them why Sarah Winchester got it?
Well, there are a lot of stories told about this mansion. The mansion started out as a 2-room house. It was owned by Sarah Winchester, the heir. Her husband was the heir to the Winchester rifle fortune. And there are a couple of different rumored stories about why she started doing this, both having to do with a spiritualist in Boston who supposedly told her that either that she needed to keep building a house because to distract the spirits of the people killed by the Winchester rifle, or she needed to build a place that would allow for spirits to come through. Because she actually had a seance room in the mansion. If you go to visit the mansion these days, you'll see a seance room. The house is most famous for the fact that Sarah would occasionally tell people, don't stop doing that room. You don't have to tear it down, just add to it in this way. And so you open a door and there's a stairway that goes to the ceiling. There are windows sometimes in the floor, looking down on the floor below. There are doors that go to the outside that don't exit to anything. So it was built in a very haphazard way, and it was added on to where it was a huge, huge mansion, part of which was unfortunately destroyed. There was a third floor that was destroyed during the 1906 earthquake, but an incredibly huge place. It got the reputation because it's such a weird place of being haunted. And there are a lot of stories about who the ghost is and such. My late co-author, Annette Martin, who was a psychic and medium who lived actually in the area of the Winchester House, and her office was right down the road from there. So she actually got to know the various managers and people there for many years. I met one of the managers in the 1980s and subsequently talked to some other folks and had been there a number of times. And the problem is that many of the staff have been encouraged to make stories up because it makes it a spooky, great, kind of fun tour. The reality seems to be based on Annette's interactions, a few other psychics' interactions, and the witness testimony from the witnesses whose word I take much more than tour guides, and that is the maintenance guys and the security guys. Before hours, the place opens up, and after hours. One ghost, a guy named Clyde, who was apparently Sarah Winchester's handyman. He's the one who's been seen by people. People have seen a male ghost outside in the gardens. Even sometimes people driving by have seen someone. So he's the one ghost that's actually there these days, although some people swear that Sarah herself drops in to see the handyman once in a while.
Did Sarah actually die in the mansion? I know her husband died years before, but did she actually physically die there as well? I mean,
as I recall,
age?
Off the top of my head, I can't recall. I think she did. But, what we know in my field is that where you die makes less difference than where you lived.
Interesting. So I would see because of where you live, you have that attachment. Your memories are there, emotions are attached there. Let me ask.
It also could be where you work too, or it could be your favorite restaurant, or it could be your favorite hotel, or it could be your favorite bar. There are an awful lot of haunted bars and restaurants because that's where we haunt when we are alive.
There was something really interesting. I was having a discussion with a psychologist, and he asked me if I know why we remember dreams. And I simply said memory. And he said, no, absolutely not. Emotions. And when I started to think about it, when you have that happiness or that fear or that sadness, that's really, really why you remember them. So I'm starting to think, Lloyd, that the reason we are haunting the places where we spent the time the most is because our emotions are attached to that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that we have an emotional connection to not just to places, but sometimes to people as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, when you started looking into San Francisco and you wrote your guide with your co-author who sadly passed away, what made you pick San Francisco? Was it your proximity to it or because of the vastness of the city or the cases that were there?
Well, actually, this was, like I said, it was intended to be the first of the series, and since Annette lived in San Jose and I live right outside of San Francisco, and we'd investigated a few places in the city over the years, we decided to do that. And it's not exactly a guidebook the way that so many of the directories of haunted places are. We actually focused only on a few places, and what we wanted to do with this book was to give people an idea what it's like to go on an investigation with a parapsychologist and a medium. So we even include, for example, for the Queen Anne Hotel, which is an old Victorian hotel in San Francisco, which is haunted by Mary Lake, who was she was the person who ran the school when this was a school back in the 1800s, and one of her students, a little girl who died of consumption, of tuberculosis. So we include some transcripts of Annette's side of the conversation, my conversation with Annette. And one of the comments I got back from a reviewer was basically, I felt like I was with them visiting these places. And that was the intention of the book, is to give you not just where, the backstory and what we found, but also to give you the impression, here's how we do it, and here's why these things happen.
Let me ask you this. Have you ever, some people that I've talked to, most people, if they come across a ghost, they'll see an apparition or they won't, and they'll hear some noises. But there's a select few that actually see dead people. Have you ever had some sort of experience where you could see what other people can't?
Well, in general, not everybody, if you had 100 people in a room and an apparition was really there, you'd only have a few people who could actually see the ghost. It's just that for whatever reason we attune to certain things. And I've never actually visually seen a ghost myself, but I've felt, heard, and smelled. So I've had my other senses involved more or less. It's really about how the information gets processed, because what's going on is you're getting a psychic signal. Think of it as a telepathic message, a broadcast from that ghost, from that apparition, that your brain is translating, your perceptual processes translate into a visual signal, an auditory signal, an olfactory signal, into a signal that seems sensory. It's almost a form of synesthesia. It's almost a form of information kind of crossing over into the sense that it's not.
Have you ever had a conversation with a ghost, and have you ever, or even recorded EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, for those out there who don't know much about ghost hunting, that ended up being in another language?
I have not, and I do know mediums who, well, first of all, the thing that's important to know is that when you're working with a medium, and I work with a lot of mediums. I'm actually president of the Forever Family Foundation, which works specifically with spirit mediums. And at one of my favorite places, which is in the book, called the Moss Beach Distillery. It's a restaurant just south of San Francisco. My first experience there was with a Japanese medium for Japanese television, and she ended up sitting down and having a conversation with the ghost. Her side of the conversation was in Japanese, because the TV show was for Japanese television. And I asked her on camera, because I was asked to do so, does the ghost speak Japanese? And she looked at me like I was an idiot, for one thing, and she said, this is all mental communication, language is not even involved. I'm only speaking Japanese for you.
Interesting.
That's very... So it's really, it's a telepathic thing. It's kind of beyond language for the most part.
What other places stick out in your head when you, obviously you know what you wrote, and so I would think you could name off different cases, but before you even started going into various places, was there anything that you know of to be famous because this place may have been haunted and it's been told by several people over the decades? Anything like that in San Francisco that sticks out?
Well, first, I think the place when people think about San Francisco being haunted, the place that immediately comes to mind for most people is Alcatraz.
Ah, yes, that's a very good one to talk about.
Yeah. Now, Alcatraz, of course, the prison, it's really interesting. And it's interesting because the idea of when you want to think about this, when it was a prison, the prisoners themselves, what did they want to do? They didn't want to stay in Alcatraz. They wanted to escape from Alcatraz.
Yeah.
So the idea of ghosts of prisoners hanging around in Alcatraz is a little weird. Why would they want to stay there? So what we do know about Alcatraz is that in general, there are no conscious entities in the building, no spirits in the building, so to speak. But the place is haunted. And we make a distinction between place memory or between recorded information, recorded emotion from the living people at the time that they were there and someone who is conscious. And you can visually see a figure in either type of case, either a haunting, the place memory, or in an apparition case. It's just one is a recording of that person when they were alive. The other is that person after death. And there doesn't seem to be any specific conscious entities in Alcatraz. However, the guards, what used to be the guards' houses in that area, there apparently is one guard who is still there as an apparition. That's one of the things we wrote about in our book. And there was a prisoner someone who was a prisoner who died from a botched operation. He was knifed and then he died on the table died in their infirmary afterwards. And he was hanging around the laundry area, which was outside the prison itself. Annette had a conversation with him when she first encountered him, thanks to a park ranger who knew about this guy. And she got a name and she got information about how he died. And it took quite a while, but someone in the Park Service actually went through the logs and actually found this individual and that he died exactly how Annette said he did. And she helped him kind of move on. He was just simply kind of lost, you might say.
I hear that a lot from the people I was mentioning that can see the dead people, and even people who can't, whose job or one thing they like to do is to help the deceased move onto the other plane, as if, like you said, they're lost. So here's my next question is, those that are lost, do many of them not even know they're dead and not even know how they died? Or did you find that normally when you come across with your team and Annette and anybody else who was present, that whoever you come across pretty much knows what had happened to them and when it happened to them?
Most people, and the number of apparitions that stick around past, let's say, a couple of days after they die, most ghosts that people see, probably 95 to 98% of all ghost sightings are people who just died, there to say goodbye, more or less. For the ones who stick around longer, it's a wide range of reasons why they're there. Most of them do know that they're dead. Most of them do know how they died. There are a few who are seemingly in denial. I don't know that they don't know that they're dead as much as they're in denial that they're dead. It seems to be varied a little bit. We have a lot that tell the mediums and tell the psychics and tell the witnesses sometimes when the witnesses are communicating that they're afraid to move on because they don't know if there's a hell and they don't want to find out. So you have fear involved. You have attachment. The ghost of the Moss Beach Distillery, that was the place that really, she loved that place. She did not know who killed her. She was knifed from behind. She thought she knew who killed her, but she doesn't know for sure because she didn't see him, or her for that matter. And most of them do, however, do know how they died or where they died and when they died and the whole bit. It just really varies as to why they're still sticking around. And it has to do with the place or the people or their own life experience.
What is the oldest ghost or spirit of a deceased person you had seen, meaning that they had died so long ago, it boggles your mind why they're still here and haven't moved on? Anybody from hundreds of years ago or even thousands of years ago?
For me personally, the oldest, I'm trying to think, the longest running case, or I should say the longest lived, if you can say that, apparition that I've dealt with would be, I guess it would be Clyde at the Winchester House. Yeah, I'm not sure when he died exactly, but he knew Sarah in the latter part of the 19th century, so I'm guessing he would be the oldest ghost, so to speak. Kate, who is the ghost of the Moss Beach Distillery, has been there since around 1930. There are places around that have ghosts that are older. I did have a case on the East Coast when I was living in New York where the ghost might or might not. We didn't really have a chance to spend a lot of time with a medium or psychic talking to him. He might or might not have been Revolutionary War era, but I kind of think that he wasn't. I think he was just pretty much shining us on because the house was old. But just because you're dead also doesn't mean you can't lie.
That's right. That's right. I would think that would still be the case, especially if they were a little mischievous in real life. I would think that part of their personality carried on. This would actually lead to my next question before we go into other areas that were haunted. You just mentioned some cases which actually sound very benevolent, something that wouldn't be as frightening to someone who's experienced. Have you ever come across malevolent beings?
I have not met a malevolent person in life, let alone in death.
Even better.
I know there are bad people out there, and there certainly are bullies. I will say that there have been bullies, or obnoxious, and I'd like to use the A word for some of the ghosts that we've actually met. That's saying it on the air. Some of them I would not have liked in life, and I would have just basically walked away from them. They really can't hurt you except to scare you, in the sense that if somebody pops up in front of you, you can get scared, kind of like when you were a kid. If somebody jumped out of a closet and yelled boo, you get scared also. But from a physical perspective, they can't really hurt you, just from that psychological perspective. And it's mostly your own fear that does that. Have not seen, other than the bullies, and when I say bullies, I mean that they're verbally sometimes harassing people or showing up when they're not wanted. We had a peeping Tom ghost in San Francisco back in the 1980s, back in the mid-80s. The ghost would appear apparently to the woman and her daughter. She was 36, the girl was 16, when they were taking a shower. That's when he would show up. Yeah, so I would not say he was. I would say he was not malevolent, but he was certainly an ass.
Yeah. Clearly, that part of his life carried over into the other side, especially if he decided to stick there so he could watch a 36 and a 16-year-old. Did you get a time frame from him? Early 1900s, mid 1900s?
No. We never really got that far with his case. We wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I would think so too.
But the mother said that he was wearing pretty contemporary clothes, so he might have actually died not too long before.
Other places in San Francisco that you were researching for the book, what else would people that are not necessarily in the city, such as myself or some listeners in the U.S., not necessarily the international listeners, would probably know, or know at least maybe the name of or area of location?
Well, the San Francisco was home to the Presidio, the military Presidio, for a very, very long time, for a couple hundred years, in fact, going back to the Spanish. And I think people would know the Presidio these days because that's where Industrial Light and Magic is for the old, and Lucasfilm. So there's a Disney museum there in the Presidio as well. But there's the old Presidio Officers Club. And actually after it had closed as an army post, but before it was open to the public and then even rentable or leasable for some of the properties, the Officers Club called Annette and I in to investigate, and we never really got an idea who it was, other than it seemed like it was a woman dating back. Actually, I can say that would be an older one. She may have dated back to the 18th century when the Spanish were there. Because that's what Annette saw in terms of her clothing. And while the ghost wasn't very communicative, she did respond to Annette a little bit and said that she was still waiting for her love, who was off on a ship somewhere. Annette tried to explain to her, that he's running late, so don't count on him coming.
When you and Annette would go to different locations, what equipment did you bring?
Well, Annette was my best piece of equipment. So that's the most important thing to know. First of all, parapsychologists do not work like ghost hunters do on TV. We focus on the people's experiences. In fact, I do not go to places unless I know I have firsthand experiencers. I want to know that there's actually something going on. And most of the places, or I should say many of the places that the TV people go to, have rumor, and in fact the only people who have had an experience are the ghost hunters themselves, who have been supposedly investigating it since they first started following the TV shows. And this does not give you good information or good data. It doesn't give you anything to really start with. It's just not a good way to do an investigation from our perspective, and certainly from the scientific perspective. So we start with people as kind of sensors or detectors in that sense. And I've got to have that somewhat current experience, otherwise whatever was there might be gone. And that's the thing that people need to know also, is that if a place was haunted by an actual entity, by an apparition, that apparition can leave, may have crossed over, may have left for somewhere else. And even hauntings, the imprints themselves can peter out. They can kind of fade away after a time as well, depending on the environmental conditions. So that's my first piece is people, specifically witnesses. Secondarily, and actually more importantly in terms of the actual investigation, would be possibly someone who's psychically sensitive, a psychic or medium, who has already proven themselves to me as having those abilities and being able to work with us. Then we do use EMF detectors, so EM field detectors, because we have found a correlation not necessarily a causal relationship, but a correlation between these imprints of past events and higher than background magnetic fields with no particular explanation for the field itself, what's causing the field. With apparition cases, sometimes you get an effect and sometimes you don't. In fact, with all of the equipment that's out there, none of it is consistent, even close to consistent, with apparition cases at all.
I would think the only consistent one would be a net or whoever you travel with, a medium.
That's it. People are the most consistent.
That's right. We have a caller that's been waiting to speak. Area code 920, welcome to the show. Where are you calling from and what's your name?
Hey, everybody. It's Adam from Green Bay at Right Case Studios.
Adam, how you doing? Welcome to the show. You have a question for Lloyd or you have a story to tell?
Absolutely. Well, no, actually, I had a question. I wanted to redirect us back to dreaming. I'm a narcoleptic, so I go into REM sleep between 5 and 10 minutes of falling asleep. And I've noticed that most of my life, I'm not able to remember my dreams. However, there are some significant ones, of course, that if I'm able to write them down, I can remember them. I wanted to ask Lloyd his opinion on the process that Edgar Casey used, that our dreams are trying to tell us something, and or if he could tell us anything about as far as what do our dreams mean, especially for those of us who, sleeping and dreaming is such an impactful thing for us, at nighttime.
Well, in terms of Casey stuff, our dreams do tell us something. That's been pretty clear. Although, there's a lot of people on many sides of the dream issue in neuroscience and in other sciences as well, where there's a whole camp that seem to believe that we shouldn't even try to remember our dreams because it's just the garbage of the day, it's like your computer trying to defrag itself. However, the folks who have been spent decades working with dreams in dream groups and individually, the practical application of understanding your dreams far outweighs any evidence from the other side that says you shouldn't remember your dreams. So it's a very good thing. As far as what they mean, it really, those dream dictionaries really don't help a lot because that's usually the author's own symbolism. You have to figure out what your dictionary actually is. Gail Delaney, who's a dream expert here in San Francisco, has often said to ask yourself questions like, what does that represent to me? Almost look at the objects that are in your dream and the people in your dream as if you were a Martian and you're seeing them for the very first time. So you don't have the label of banana when you see that thing. So what is that? What does it mean? And that seems to help people quite a bit. The psychic side of things, which is, go ahead.
I was just going to interject. And secondly, for those of us who lucidly dream, I've heard people say, I've never dreamed in color. I've never dreamed anybody but myself. I dream as other people in color. Sometimes it's almost like I'm in another dimension living it, while I'm asleep.
Yeah.
Let me say one thought to you, to Adam and Lloyd, and by all means, Lloyd, please correct this if I'm wrong. I've heard from some people, as a matter of fact, someone who says they're the reincarnation of Edgar Casey, which I still question, which is David Wilcock, says that when you dream, keep a dream journal, and down the line, bring it over into or translate it, or basically once you hear it, if you're listening, if you're recording it, or if you physically write it, once you write it again, then you start to see the parallels in what happened in your dreams and what happened in life. And then he claims at some point you're going to start to remember your dreams. Lloyd, do you know if that's possible or what the benefits are to having a dream?
I mean, first of all, recording your dreams, writing them down or recording them in any other way and then going back over them later on actually can sometimes help you understand what the dream meant. Because when you first wake up is when your memory of that dream is much better, and then it fades. So writing it down reinforces that dream itself. It helps you remember it more, and later on when you go over it, you may even remember more details that are lodged in your unconscious. In fact, the technique called dream incubation. The Egyptians did it, for example, where this is probably where our phrase, I'm going to sleep on it, when you're thinking about decisions, comes from. If you tell yourself when you're falling asleep, I will remember my dreams, and you can even tell yourself, I am going to dream about asking my boss for a raise tomorrow. You can actually program your dreams once you actually started remembering your dreams. But the process of writing them down, or telling someone else for that matter in the morning when you first wake up, reinforces the recollection, and it does help you remember even more dreams down the line. The thing about psychic dreams is psychic dreams just feel different to people. They have a different sense of reality to them. Everybody I interviewed who's ever had a psychic dream, the only reason they knew it was different was either when they wrote it down and later on saw that that dream came true. That's one way they knew. But most of the time, at the time that they remembered the dream or wrote it down or recorded it, it felt different. And that's all they ever say to me. I can't explain how it felt, but it felt different than all my other dreams.
Adam?
I want to say that I'm pretty sure. I also what you're saying that David Wolcock has said. I want to say that I have seen that repeated almost verbatim in the Edgar Cayce Foundation. You know, they do those little seminars.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure that exact. Write it down and follow those steps, and you will eventually be able to recall them.
Well, that's actually
I've
not
never
just
been able to
Cayce.
do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of other people who have written that down. Montague Ullman, and there's a kind of a Scandinavian dream work method. This comes from the Sonoy. The Iroquois actually used to have group discussions of their dreams to help each other understand their dreams and remember them. So it goes back a ways. It's well before Edgar Cayce.
Any other questions, Adam?
And just lastly, any opinions on deja vu, as it is said?
Well, I have a colleague up in Seattle, and he actually has a doctoral dissertation many, many decades ago, studied deja vu, and he's since probably studied it I don't know how many more years. He's the leading expert, and he has come up with 48 possible explanations for a given deja vu. Everything from you are feeling familiar because you had been there or someplace like it before but forgot. You're having that experience because you had a dream that you had forgotten about that place. You had a precognitive dream or just a precognitive vision, to something about precognition even picking up information a few seconds in advance. So yes, it feels like you've been there before, but it's because you're getting that information before you even walk into the place. And there's so many other possible explanations that he came up with. There's not a single given one.
Emotions too, right? I would think that if you're somewhere and you're feeling an emotion that triggers something else, then you feel that deja vu feeling only because of that emotion, not necessarily what you're doing.
Smells can do that too, because we have a function called red integration, that a smell can trigger a memory and a sense of being somewhere before. So there's, again, that's yet another one of the 48.
I was going to wishfully suggest that it's a correlation to another dimension possible,
That could be. I don't
think
that was one of his 48, so maybe that's number 49.
Well said.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking my questions.
Sure. Thanks for calling, Adam. And by the way, everybody who's listening, Adam at Aerbach Studios is my top moderator. So, Adam, I want to thank you for that.
Oh, no problem.
All right. Now, Lloyd, I'm going to take the conversation a little bit back now and go into your early life. When did you first start noticing that your sixth sense was more powerful than other people's, which ultimately led you down your path?
Well, that's actually has nothing to do with what led me down my path, and I can't say that I really had many psychic experiences until I got into the field directly.
Oh.
I can almost pinpoint my very first sensation was in a case, my very first case in 1979, but I've been interested in parapsychology since I was a little kid because of comic books and science fiction and TV shows, that especially Dark Shadows in the 1960s, that got me hooked into reading books by researchers in the field. I was a little science geek, and as soon as I found out there were actually books on science of psychic phenomena, I just glommed onto them, and even started a parapsychology club in my high school. But I didn't have any experiences at all, really, other than knowing who might have been on the phone once in a while, until I actually got into graduate school.
When you got into graduate school, what did you learn that could unlock or make your sixth sense a little more powerful?
Well, that wasn't the target. That wasn't the aim of our schooling. The programs in parapsychology are more about studying the phenomena, not about experiencing it, although we did have a little bit of that from a couple of the instructors. My first experience just happened. And really, I couldn't say that I learned anything about how to develop anything until I worked in my first job in the field after I got out of grad school, which was for the American Society for Psychical Research in New York City. That's the nation's oldest organization. And we were doing research, although I was not directly involved in research, we were doing research on out-of-body experiences with a gent by the name of Alex Tanis, who was a psychic and medium from Maine who would come down to New York every couple of weeks to do research on his own dime. And Alex and I sat and chatted for quite some time, all the time. I just liked the guy. And when I asked him, how do I become more psychic? And he said, the first step for becoming more psychic is to notice that you already are. We're all psychic. We're all scanning the environment. We just don't notice the information because either it's not important enough to get past our normal sensory information, or it's just simply out of our earshot, or we're not attending to it. Kind of like, noise in the background that you're not hearing that's there because you don't want to hear it, or it's not necessary to hear it. We hear there are a lot of sounds around us, and we focus our sounds on different sounds based on our attention.
So it comes down to one word then, listening, paying attention, really, right?
Noticing.
That's a far better word. Now, you said, what time frame was this? Was it 79 or before 79?
So that was actually I worked with Alex. I worked at the ASPR from 82 to most of 83. And then I came back out to John F. Kennedy University when we still had the graduate program, and I was working in the program. Did work with a few psychics here and there. I've never really focused on trying to make myself more psychic because I work with psychics. I'm the scientist. I'm the guy who's trying to gather the data and figure out what's going on. I'm the lead detective. I let the other detectives, the lower people, do the other thing.
Now, clearly there are a lot of people who would want to go into this field. I know I would obviously love to go in. And as you mentioned that there are no programs in the United States. So this is more of a basic question. In your mind, or from what you gather, do you know why they literally abolished every parapsychology program in the United States?
Well, there really only had been one, and that was JFK. So it was the first and only accredited master's program in parapsychology. There was only one undergrad program at Franklin Pierce College in New Hampshire, and I think attrition probably got rid of that one more than anything else. They just didn't have enough students for it. The fact is, academically, one issue, and it's more of an issue today than it has been in the past, is that there's not been a job market because the funding in parapsychology is abysmal. It's terrible. We only have one major foundation that even funds any research in parapsychology these days. It's worse than it was 40 years ago. And that I attribute directly to the rise of the organized skeptics organizations more than anything else.
And the skeptics have gone up significantly. They're all over the place,
Yeah, and they wear their skepticism. It's not even the thing is, they're not skeptics. They're cynics. They're disbelievers. They're debunkers. A skeptic is someone who looks at something and doesn't decide. They actually look at the evidence. But the very fact that, and this has been very clear by some of the research that's been published in mainstream journals, and the reaction from scientists who call themselves skeptics. One of my colleagues, Darrell Bem at Cornell University, published a paper on a precognition experiment he did at Cornell. And when it was announced that this mainstream psychology journal was going to publish this study, there was this incredible backlash against the publication, against the journal, and a hue and cry amongst the skeptics saying, how dare they publish this ridiculous paper. And they didn't even know if Darrell had come up with the results that it was all chance. I mean, they didn't even know if he had a study that was supporting their position. They just said, this has got to be garbage. And when some scientists, big name scientists in many other fields were asked questions like, what do you think? And they would say, well, it's worthless. It shouldn't be done. This mainstream journal is wasting our time and effort, and it's wasting funding. And they would be asked, did you read the paper? And most of them they all said no. Nobody actually asked for the paper in general. But some of them actually said, why would I? ESP doesn't exist. And that's about the most ridiculous, unscientific statement you can possibly make. And that's not an indication of skepticism. That is an indication of faith, the faith that this does not exist.
in today's world, even though we have these professional debunkers, which they're always paid very handsomely, I've known that from people that I've worked with involved in ufology. For instance, Dr. Roger Lear, the alien implant doctor, used to butt heads with him all the time because he's got something tangible that has been tested in laboratories and been shown to have, things that really you can't explain. But I would think in today's world, Lloyd, people would gravitate more towards parapsychology, considering what's been happening, and the youngest generation having such open minds about our abilities of our minds and what else is out there that mainstream science hasn't covered. I would think they'd be jumping if there were such programs, and I would hope that more people would donate to places for grants, because this is more than needed now than I think 40, 50 years ago.
Well, we're seeing a couple of issues. One is that there is no job market because there's no funding. So it's kind of a vicious circle there. And that's an important thing for a university. If a university was even going to start a program, first of all, they have to have the money to start the program. So somebody would have to come to a university with a ton of money and not just give money to a program, but also give money generally to the university, to the administration to support all of that as well. So there are a lot of issues economically that are involved with that. Second thing is that when we're talking about people interested, there's more and more people interested in coming out and talking about their interest in the paranormal. The problem is that so many of them follow the TV shows.
Yes.
And so there's thousands and thousands of amateur ghost hunters or hobbyist ghost hunters and paranormal investigators who follow what they see on TV, and none of those shows support parapsychology. In fact, ghost hunters made a point of not talking to any researcher or scientist early on, or even any psychic early on. Other shows avoided it, and the ones that came to us, the couple that actually came to us, what they wanted us to do, I turned down many of those shows, a couple of those series that wanted me on, Paranormal State wanted me on the show desperately. Some of the folks on that team, the Penn State group, wanted me on the show, and it's like, that show was about demons because that's what Ryan Buell was interested in, and that's not what we do. They played with the truth, and that's what those reality shows do, is they don't really show what's going on, so we stayed away from them. But what this has done is completely divorced or separated most of that community from the actual field. And very few of them are at all interested in actual science. They just want to play with their toys out in the field. I find that I talk to my students. I offer courses through the Rhine Research Center, which used to be the Duke Parapsychology Lab back before the 60s. But the Rhine Center offers online courses. So I'm right now in the middle of teaching an investigations class. And there should be hundreds of people coming to these classes. We have a few.
Again, when you talked about those reality shows, that reminds me of what we talked about with the Randy $1 million challenge. Would you do it for money and be labeled the way the TV wants to spin it? Or would you rather do something? This is obviously a hypothetical because you already answered the question.
All right, well, let me give you an honest answer. Honest answer is, if those shows actually paid reasonable amounts of money, I would do them. But most reality shows don't even want to pay the talent initially.
That's sad. That's actually sad.
I know Barry Taff and I have both been approached by shows and to be on the show. And sometimes, if the producers are really coming up with a good concept and really can show that they have a true interest, I'm willing to do something for next to nothing or even nothing if it's really going to further education in the field or about the phenomena. But all too often, things get altered by the network people and we have to walk away. Or they offer us, they want us to. I had one show who said, okay, you have to get yourself to Kansas City. It's like, what? Excuse me?
They wanted you to fly yourself?
Yeah. I mean, but that even happened on a network show years ago where some smart ass production assistant thought he'd save money for the show by asking me if I wanted. Don't you want to be in a national show? And he asked me to fly myself to New York. It's like 3 days before the show. So there's an attitude, especially reality TV. There's an attitude that if we can avoid paying anybody anything, that's great. Keeps our budgets down. But that doesn't really work in reality.
I was going to say, and also for them, they're still raking in all the money. It's not like they're telling their advertisers, hey, by the way, we have a lower budget, so you could pay us less too. No, it's all about the bottom dollar because Ford and Pepsi Cola are still paying the same to advertise.
Yeah, the production people are all making their salaries. Everybody on that show, other than the so-called talent and the witnesses, people are being interviewed, are making money, and they're making a decent salary. For cable, they may not be making certainly as much as a union job on network, but for a network, but they're making a good salary. And to offer $0 or like almost an insulting amount, and I actually was asked to do an interview a few years ago on a show. This was for the USS Hornet Aircraft Carrier Museum, which is one of the most haunted places. It's here in the Bay Area in Alameda, outside of Oakland. And they wanted me to do an interview for about the ship for this one show, which was originally on Fox Family, that became ABC Family, and something else, I guess Freeform now. But I ended up on a phone call with the head of legal for Fox, because I wouldn't sign the release form because they wanted me to basically sign a non-disclosure forever and never talk about it. And there were all sorts of other conditions they had in it, and they weren't paying me anything anyway. And I made some changes to the form, and they told me I couldn't do that. And when I got on the phone with the guy, he flat out said, and I was on with the producer as well, he didn't know who I was. The producer certainly knew how much TV I had done, but he didn't know who I was. And he said, "Don't you want to be on TV? Isn't that why you want to do this?" It's like, yeah, no, I'm only doing this for the USS Hornet. I don't need to be paid, but I also don't need to be jerked around.
It's sad that it's really sad that they're not giving credence to a topic that is definitely super important. I mean, this is the study of our heads and our minds. We've gone a minute over, but I still want to talk to you briefly real quick because of the fact that it is Halloween. I was hoping you could tell people one more story briefly, maybe about a place you visited, ghosts that you and Annette encountered, anything like that you think would be appropriate for tomorrow night.
Sure. Well, I can talk about the USS Hornet because I think it's a great place if people come to the Bay Area. It's one of the best places to go to. It is an old aircraft carrier. It was a World War II class aircraft carrier. It also is the carrier that picked up Apollo 11 and 12. So it ran from 1943 to 1970 when it was decommissioned. It sat in shipyards for a while. They brought it out of the shipyards in 1995 after the closure of the Alameda base, and it was rescued from being junked by a foundation. As they were cleaning it up to open it as a museum in 98, several of the volunteers started seeing sailors and officers observing their work when there weren't any Navy personnel aboard ship, and these guys would actually disappear while they were looking at them. So this, I was brought in by a psychic who had already been brought in by somebody on the board who knew her, who had been going to her for readings. And very clearly in talking to the witnesses, and this is after the ship actually opened as a museum, the docents, people working on the ship, some of the liveaboard volunteers, it was very clear that we had an unusual circumstance of multiple witnesses, so 12 people seeing the same ghost at the same time. Very unusual. Two guys seeing an officer, one of the guys being a former Navy SEAL, who saw an officer peek his head up a ladder and then take a head down, making no sound on these steel ladders, with the former Navy SEAL running after him to find out why he was aboard ship after hours, and the guy just completely vanished. They actually basically went into a dead end, and there was nobody there. There have been a lot of sailors and officers seen there, and the general theme is, based on the witnesses get a feeling about this, the psychics who have been aboard have found this as well, that these gentlemen, these sailors and officers, very few of them actually died aboard the ship. Some of them, we've actually identified a couple of them because they were recognizable from old photos. They were high enough profile that they did not even die during the time the ship was in operation. They died after the ship had been decommissioned. But they served aboard the ship. And the general feeling is that these guys came back to the ship after it was brought back down to Alameda to make sure the ship stayed open as living history, because it is a museum. It is a bit of real important history. This was the lead ship in the Pacific Fleet and the ship that picked up Apollo 11 and 12. So it's a very happy place. I think the sailors and officers who were there are watching over the ship, and it's a very unusual place. You'd expect a warship to have a different feeling than this place actually does.
And the historical memories and, like you said, the significance of what it picked up the Apollo 11 and 12, I would think, is why these soldiers gravitated back there. And like you said, how they wanted to keep it open and in living memory. This case fits more so.
some of the older docents who have now passed away, when I asked them back in the late 90s, you're in your 80s, why are you volunteering? And they would say, because this ship represents one of the best times of my life.
And again, that would make sense throughout the recurring theme of what you said of why, if they haven't died there, because they spent not just time there and a significant time there, but probably throughout their lives, the most important period was on that ship, especially like you mentioned, the significance it had of picking up Apollo 11 and 12, because there only was a handful of Apollo missions anyway. So anything that would be connected to it, I think, would be a huge part of anyone's life. Anyhow, Lloyd, I want to thank you so much for this interview. But before we go, obviously, next time I'm going to need you for 2 hours. That's for sure, because we definitely ran out of time. But I want you to plug in things like your investigations course, where people can see it, your 10 books, where people can buy them, and websites you have, anything you want.
So most of my books are available on Amazon. Several of them are out of print right now. I'm actually going to be bringing a couple of them back into print. It's Lloyd Aerbach. It's Lloyd with one L, L-O-Y-D, and it's A-U-E-R-B-A-C-H. So Amazon has my books. You can find out about the courses through the Rhine Center. It's rhine.org, and just look for the education link. But also consider joining the Rhine Center to support the research. You'd have access to an incredibly great media library of lectures and presentations there as well. But the courses are available, so please check that out. And then the Forever Family Foundation, if anybody happens to be in Fort Myers, Florida in a couple of weeks, we have our annual, or I should say our biannual mediumship conference, Science and Mediumship, happening on the 9th, 10th, and 11th of November in Fort Myers, Florida. And if you go to foreverfamilyfoundation.org, you can join the foundation for free, and you can find out about this event and other events with our mediums as well.
Well said, everybody. I do hope you do check out Mr. Aerbach's books, as well as seeing if you could take his course and going through the Rhine Center. Again, all the information is also posted on my website under his name. So, Lloyd, again, I want to thank you for joining us. Everybody listening, stay tuned. After we come back from break, we're going to speak with Mr. John Potash. And with that being said, Lloyd, I do want to, aside from thanking you, I do want to wish you a happy Halloween. And thanks again for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Happy Halloween to you.
Thanks again. Everybody stay tuned. Like I said, we'll be right back with another guest.